Section 131 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. September 23, 1904. Miss Clemens in concert. Mark Twain makes a speech at his daughter's debut. Special to the New York Times. Winsted, Connecticut, September 22. Before a large audience in the Norfolk Gymnasium, Norfolk, this evening, Miss Clara Clemens, the daughter of Mark Twain, made her debut as a concert singer. A large delegation of the young singer's friends was present from New York and other places. Miss Clemens was assisted by Marie Nichols, a Boston violinist. Miss Clemens, who is the possessor of a rich contralto voice, was enthusiastically received. Mark Twain made a short speech at the close of the recital. He described his first appearance before an audience in San Francisco, and told of a sudden stage fright that overcame him then. He compared stage fright to seasickness, and said he wished his choicest enemy could have both at the same time. End of section 131, September 23, 1906. Miss Clemens in concert. Read by John Greenman. Section 132 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. November 5, 1906. Mark Twain endorses exposure of Mrs. Eddy. He says Mr. Wright proves she didn't write Science and Health. His own book unpublished. And Mr. Clemens says he doesn't know why his argument against her claims has been suppressed. Mark Twain, whose book, intended to prove that Mrs. Mary Baker G. Eddy could not have written such a finished literary work as Science and Health, has never been published, was brought into the Christian Science controversy yesterday. The introduction of Mr. Clemens into the controversy was due to the publication yesterday of a manuscript written by Livingston Wright of Boston in 1901, in which Mr. Wright contends that it was the late Reverend J. Henry Wigan who revised and rewrote Science and Health. Mark Twain, owing to his familiarity with the subject, was selected by Mr. Wright to look over his manuscript. Mr. Clemens, after carefully reading the manuscript, gave it his endorsement and declared that he could not at that time, 1903, understand why Mr. Wright had waited 2 years without publishing so interesting and valuable a paper. In his manuscript, Mr. Wright, who is the literary executor of the Reverend Mr. Wigan, states that Mr. Wigan, in August, 1885, received a call at his office in the old Boston Music Hall from a man who said he was Calvin A. Fry. Fry said that he represented a woman who wished to have a manuscript revised. A few days later Mrs. Eddy called on Mr. Wigan, and the outcome of that visit was the contract for Mr. Wigan to revise Science and Health. Mr. Wigan told Mr. Wright that when he opened the manuscript he was surprised by the misspelling, the lack of punctuation, and the chaotic arrangement of the subjects. Mr. Wigan said there were passages that flatly contradicted others that had preceded them, while incorrect references to historical and philosophical matters were scattered all through the Eddy manuscript. Mr. Wigan revised the work and added a chapter entitled Wayside Hints. The book that is now known as Science and Health was the result. In his lifetime Mr. Wigan kept the secret of his participation in the preparation of the Eddy book from the public, but he left instructions with Mr. Wright, as his literary executor, to make public at the proper time the truth about Science and Health. When Mr. Wright sent his manuscript containing the statement of Mr. Wigan's part in the publication to Mark Twain, the latter sent him the following reply, which Mr. Clemens said yesterday was self-explanatory of his interest in the matter. The letter is as follows: Riverdale, New York City, April 17, 1903. Dear Sir, the manuscript with your letter of yesterday arrived in my bedroom with my breakfast 2 hours ago, and I have already read the manuscript through. I wonder why you have kept it 2 years without publishing it, for I find it exceedingly interesting and valuable, and with only one weak place in it that I can discover, the same one that is in Mr. Peabody's pamphlet, the presenting, on your page 28, of that grotesque eruption of Mrs. Eddy's in print form instead of, at least partly, in facsimile reproduction of her hand. With that defect cured, your essay would gain great strength, but it is convincingly strong, strong enough in my belief to prove to every intelligent non-scientist that Mrs. Eddy and God did not write Science and Health. All the world and God added could not convince a scientist, intelligent or otherwise, that Mrs. Eddy's claim to the authorship is a lie and a swindle. The first paragraph of your letter requires me to make instant decision or return your manuscript. Therefore, as I am not able to act so quickly, I am in bed these 5 days with bronchitis and barred from work. I will make the return per today's next mail, as in honor bound. I am puzzled. In the new part of my book I take up a great deal of space with an elaborate argument reinforced by extracts from Mrs. Eddy's literature to prove that she couldn't write Science and Health, and must have stolen it. Circumstantial evidence, the whole of it, and now comes your essay and proves the same points by what the world would consider much better evidence. It's like a man trying to prove by labored and fine-spun logic that there has been a murder, and then, when he gets through, remarking to the stage manager, "Ask Mr. Wright to fetch in that corpse." A reader might properly say, "Why did you make me read all that stuff, when you might have introduced Mr. Wright and the corpse in the first place, and saved my time?" Either process would do in a book, but doubtless to use one would bar the other from the book. I learn by a letter from a stranger that my book has been withdrawn until autumn. It is true. I did it myself. I wonder how he knows. I have not said it publicly. Very truly yours, S. L. Clemens. Yesterday, at his home, 21 Fifth Avenue, Mr. Clemens said that he did not know why his book, which he said is still in the hands of his publishers, had never reached the public. He said that the nature of the work was indicated in his letter to Mr. Wright. Beyond this, he added, under the circumstances he could not talk at present. End of section 132, November 5, 1906. Mark Twain endorses exposure of Mrs. Eddy. Read by John Greenman. Section 133 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. November 24, 1906. Bar Mark Twain's book. A Massachusetts librarian draws the line at Eve's Diary. Special to the New York Times. Worcester, Massachusetts, November 23. Eve's Diary by Mark Twain, a copy of which is among 100 books recently bought for the Charlton Public Library, has been barred by Frank O. Wakefield, one of the trustees. The other trustees, the Rev. G. O. Janess and Louis A. McIntyre, concur with him. The other 99 books are all right, but this one book, Mr. Wakefield says, is objectionable. That is because there are pictures in the book of a kind to which Mr. Wakefield objects. Before Eve's Diary could go on the circulating shelves, the librarian, Mrs. H. L. Carpenter, looked it through. She saw the pictures and made known to Mr. Wakefield that she had her doubts. On every left-hand page is a picture, 50 of which represent Eve in summer costume. Her dresses are all cut Garden of Eden style. In one of them Eve is seen skipping through the bushes unrestrained and not at all afraid. The bushes do not seriously cut off the view of Eve. After looking long and earnestly at one picture depicting Eve pensively reclining on a rock, Mr. Wakefield decided to act. Mr. Clemens sent out word last night to a Times reporter, who conveyed to him the substance of this dispatch, that the action of the Charlton Library was not of the slightest interest to him. End of Section 133, November 24, 1906. Bar Mark Twain's book. Read by John Greenman. Section 134 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 8, 1906. Mark Twain in white amuses congressmen. Advocates new copyright law and dress reform. Wears light flannel suit. Says at 71 dark colors depress him. Talks seriously of author's right to profits. Special to the New York Times. Washington, December 7th. Mark Twain spent a busy afternoon at the Capitol today, and for half an hour entertained the newspaper correspondents with a characteristic talk. Despite the blustering wind which swept down Pennsylvania Avenue, the author wore a suit of white flannels. In the members' gallery, which he first visited to watch the proceedings of the House, he attracted general attention. Later Mr. Clemens visited the Speaker's room, and, while awaiting the arrival of Uncle Joe, entertained a dozen congressmen, including Grosvenor, Payne, Dalzell, and Foster, who hastened to pay him their respects. With the Speaker Mr. Clemens discussed briefly the pending copyright bill. With William Dean Howells and a party of other authors and publishers, Mr. Clemens came here to be present at the hearings on this bill, which are now being conducted in the Senate reading room at the Congressional Library by the Committee on Patents of the Senate and the House. With Mr. Howells, Edward Everett Hale, Thomas Nelson Page, and a number of other authors, he appeared before the committee this afternoon. The new copyright bill extends the author's copyright for the term of his life and for 50 years thereafter. It is also for the benefit of artists, musicians, and others, but the authors did most of the talking. F. D. Millet made a speech for the artists, and John Philip Sousa for the musicians. Committee enjoys Twain's speech. Mr. Clemens was the last speaker of the day and its chief feature. He made a speech the serious parts of which created a strong impression, and the humorous parts set the senators and representatives in roars of laughter. "I have read this bill," he began. "At least I have read such portions as I could understand. Nobody but a practised legislator can read the bill and thoroughly understand it, and I am not a practised legislator. I am interested particularly and especially in the part of the bill which concerns my trade. I like that extension of copyright life to the author's life and 50 years afterward. I think that would satisfy any reasonable author, because it would take care of his children. Let the grandchildren take care of themselves. That would take care of my daughters, and after that I am not particular. I shall, then, have long been out of this struggle, independent of it, indifferent to it. It isn't objectionable to me that all the trades and professions in the United States are protected by the bill. I like that. They are all important and worthy, and if we can take care of them under the copyright law, I should like to see it done. I should like to see oyster culture added, and anything else. I am aware that copyright must have a limit, because that is required by the Constitution of the United States, which sets aside the earlier Constitution, which we call the Decalogue. The Decalogue says you shall not take away from any man his profit. I don't like, he explained, to use the harsh term. What the Decalogue really says is, "Thou shalt not steal," but I am trying to use more polite language. The laws of England and America do take it away, do select but one class, the people who create the literature of the land. They always talk handsomely about the literature of the land, always what a fine, great, monumental thing a great literature is, and in the midst of their enthusiasm they turn around and do what they can to discourage it. I know we must have a limit, but 42 years is too much of a limit. I am quite unable to guess why there should be a limit at all to the possession of the product of a man's labor. There is no limit to real estate. Dr. Hale has suggested that a man might just as well, after discovering a coal mine and working it 42 years, have the government step in and take it away. Says publishers never die. What is the excuse? It is that the author who produced that book has had the profit of it long enough, and therefore the government takes a profit which does not belong to it and generously gives it to the 88,000,000 of people. But it doesn't do anything of the kind. It merely takes the author's property, takes his children's bread, and gives the publisher double profit. He goes on publishing the book, and as many of his confederates as choose to go into the conspiracy do so, and they rear families in affluence, and they continue the enjoyment of those ill gotten gains generation after generation forever, for they never die. In a few weeks or months or years I shall be out of it, I hope under a monument. I hope I shall not be entirely forgotten, and I shall subscribe to the monument myself. But I shall not be caring what happens if there is 50 years left of my copyright. My copyright produces annually a good deal more than I can use, but my children can use it. I can get along. I know a lot of trades, but that goes to my daughters, who can't get along as well as I can, because I have carefully raised them as young ladies, who don't know anything and can't do anything. I hope Congress will extend to them the charity which they have failed to get from me. No limit on families. Why, if a man who is not even mad, but only strenuous about race suicide, should come to me and try to get me to use my large political and ecclesiastical influence to get a bill passed by this Congress limiting families to 22 children by one mother, I should try to calm him down. I should reason with him. I should say to him, leave it alone. Leave it alone and it will take care of itself. Only one couple a year in the United States can reach that limit. If they have reached that limit, let them go right on. Let them have all the liberty they want. In restricting that family to 22 children, you are merely conferring discomfort and unhappiness on one family per year in a nation of 88 million, which is not worth while. It is the very same with copyright. One author per year produces a book which can outlive the 42-year limit. That's all. This nation can't produce two authors a year that can do it. The thing is demonstrably impossible. All that the limited copyright can do is to take the bread out of the mouths of the children of that one author per year. The Books That Live. I made an estimate some years ago, when I appeared before a committee of the House of Lords, that we had published in this country since the Declaration of Independence 220,000 books. They have all gone. They had all perished before they were 10 years old. It is only one book in 1,000 that can outlive the 42-year limit. Therefore, why put a limit at all? You might as well limit the family to 22 children. If you recall, the Americans in the 19th century who wrote books that lived 42 years, you will have to begin with Cooper. You can follow with Washington Irving, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Edgar Allan Poe, and there you have to wait a long time. You come to Emerson, and you have to stand still and look further. You find Howells and T.B. Aldrich, and then your numbers begin to run pretty thin, and you question if you can name 20 persons in the United States who in a whole century have written books that would live 42 years. Why, you could take them all and put them on one bench there, pointing. Add the wives and children, and you could put the result in 2 or 3 more benches. 100 persons, that is the little insignificant crowd whose bread and butter is to be taken away for what purpose? For what profit to anybody? You turn these few books into the hands of the pirate and of the legitimate publisher, too, and they get the profit that should have gone to the wife and children. Property in Ideas. When I appeared before that committee of the House of Lords, the chairman asked me what limit I would propose. I said, perpetuity. I could see some resentment in his manner, and he said the idea was illogical, for the reason that it has long ago been decided that there can be no such thing as property in ideas. I said there was property in ideas before Queen Anne's time. They had perpetual copyright. He said, "What is a book? A book is just built from base to roof on ideas, and there can be no property in it." I said I wished he could mention any kind of property on this planet that had a pecuniary value which was not derived from an idea or ideas. He said real estate. I put a supposititious case, a dozen Englishmen who travel through South Africa and camp out, and 11 of them see nothing at all. They are mentally blind, but there is one in the party who knows what this harbor means and what the lay of the land means. To him it means that some day a railway will go through here, and there on that harbor a great city will spring up. That is his idea. And he has another idea, which is to go and trade his last bottle of Scotch whisky and his last horse blanket to the principal chief of that region and buy a piece of land the size of Pennsylvania. Laughter. That was the value of an idea that the day would come when the Cape to Cairo Railway would be built. Every improvement that is put upon the real estate is the result of an idea in somebody's head. The skyscraper is another idea. The railroad is another. The telephone and all those things are merely symbols which represent ideas. An andiron, a washtub, is the result of an idea that did not exist before. So if, as that gentleman said, a book does consist solely of ideas, that is the best argument in the world that it is property and should not be under any limitations at all. We don't ask for that. 50 years from now we shall ask for it. And then he tells a story. I hope the bill will pass without any deleterious amendments. I do seem to be extraordinarily interested in a whole lot of arts and things that I have got nothing to do with. It is a part of my generous, liberal nature. I can't help it. I feel the same sort of charity to everybody that was manifested by a gentleman who arrived at home at 2 o'clock in the morning from the club, and was feeling so perfectly satisfied with life, so happy and so comfortable, and there was his house weaving, weaving around. He watched his chance, and by, when the steps got in his neighborhood, he made a jump and climbed up and got on the portico. And the house went on weaving and weaving, but he watched the door, and when it came around his way he plunged through it. He got to the stairs, and when he went up on all fours the house was so unsteady that he could hardly make his way. But at last he got to the top and raised his foot and put it on the top step, but only the toe hitched on the step, and he rolled down and fetched up on the bottom step with his arm around the newel post, and he said, God pity the poor sailors out at sea on a night like this. An advocate of dress reform. While waiting to appear before the committee, Mr. Clemens talked to the reporters. Why don't you ask why I am wearing such apparently unseasonable cloths? I'll tell you. I have found that when a man reaches the advanced age of 71 years, as I have, the continual sight of dark clothing is likely to have a depressing effect upon him. Light-colored clothing is more pleasing to the eye and enlivens the spirit. Now, of course, I cannot compel every one to wear such clothing just for my especial benefit. So I do the next best thing and wear it myself. Of course, before a man reaches my years the fear of criticism might prevent him from indulging his fancy. I am not afraid of that. I am decidedly for pleasing color combinations in dress. I like to see the women's clothes, say, at the opera. What can be more depressing than the somber black which custom requires men to wear upon state occasions? A group of men in evening clothes looks like a flock of crows, and is just about as inspiring. After all, what is the purpose of clothing? Are not clothes intended primarily to preserve dignity and also to afford comfort to the wearer? Now I know of nothing more uncomfortable than the present day clothes of men. The finest clothing made is a person's own skin, but of course society demands something more than this. The best dressed man I have ever seen, however, was a native of the Sandwich Islands who attracted my attention 30 years ago. Now, when that man wanted to don especial dress to honor a public occasion or a holiday, why, he occasionally put on a pair of spectacles. Otherwise, the clothing with which God had provided him sufficed. Of course, I have ideas of dress reform. For one thing, why not adopt some of the women's styles? Goodness knows they adopt enough of ours. Take the peekaboo waist, for instance. It has the obvious advantages of being cool and comfortable, and, in addition, it is almost always made up in pleasing colors, which cheer and do not depress. It is true that I dressed the Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's court in a plug hat, but let's see, that was 25 years ago. Then no man was considered fully dressed until he donned a plug hat. Nowadays I think that no man is dressed until he leaves it home. Why, when I left home yesterday they trotted out a plug hat for me to wear. "You must wear it," they told me. Why, just think of going to Washington without a plug hat! But I said no, I would wear a derby or nothing. Why, I believe I could walk along the streets of New York I never do, but still I think I could and I should never see a well dressed man wearing a plug hat. If I did I should suspect him of something. I don't know just what, but I would suspect him. Why, when I got up on the second story of that Pennsylvania ferry boat coming down here yesterday I saw Howells coming along. He was the only man on the boat with a plug hat, and I tell you he felt ashamed of himself. He said he had been persuaded to wear it against his better sense. But just think of a man nearly 70 years old who has not a mind of his own on such matters. End of section 134, December 8, 1906. Mark Twain in White Amuses Congressmen. Read by John Greenman. Section 135 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by John Greenman. December 9, 1906. Twain pleads for thanks. Asks Uncle Joe to get it from Congress, quickly, too. Special to the New York Times. Washington, December 8th. Mark Twain, who is here doing what he can to get the new copyright bill passed, finds that he is handicapped as a lobbyist by not being able to go on the floor of the House and talk to Congressmen while the House is in session. He finds that, aside from ex office holders, the only outsiders who can get in are persons to whom the thanks of Congress have been extended. So he wrote the following letter to the Speaker today: Dear Uncle Joseph, please get me the thanks of Congress, not next week, but right away. It is very necessary to accomplish this for your affectionate old friend right away. By persuasion if you can, by violence if you must, for it is imperatively necessary that I get on the floor for 2 or 3 hours and talk to the members, man by man, in behalf of support, encouragement, and protection of one of the nation's most valuable assets and industries, its literature. I have arguments with me, also a barrel with liquid in it. Give me a chance. Get me the thanks of Congress. Don't wait for others. There isn't time. Furnish them to me yourself and let Congress ratify it later. I have stayed away and let Congress alone for 71 years, am entitled to its thanks. Congress knows it perfectly well, and I have long felt hurt that this quite proper and earned expression of gratitude has been merely felt by the House and never publicly uttered. Send me an order on the Sergeant at Arms, quick. When shall I come? With love and benediction, Mark Twain. End of section 135, December 9, 1906. Twain pleads for thanks. Read by John Greenman. Section 136 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 10, 1906. Editorial. A Humorist at His Best. Mark Twain was the star performer for the authors and publishers at the copyright hearing in Washington last week, and it was certainly a star performance that he gave. Wearing a white suit on a cold December day was a new development of his humor, but we would all do that if, as Mr. Clemens has apparently come to be, we were as wise as the polar bears. The bears, however, wear white not only because it keeps them warmer than black would, but because it enables them to traverse the Arctic landscape unseen by their watchful dinners, and the amiable humorist could not have had that motive when he selected garments for this journey. His white suit did not enable him to leap unexpectedly upon the senators and representatives forming the committees on patents, but it may have helped him in some mysterious way to emphasize the magnificent speech he made in vindication of the author's property right in the product of his brain. That speech presented the copyright subject most pleasingly variegated by shifting lights of many colors, and made it absolutely interesting, which was a great achievement, for copyright arguments are apt to be rather dull, and to hurt us by revealing that the authors whom we so much revere do not write wholly for fame and a cause, as we would like to believe, since it would decrease the price of books. Mr. Clemens was not modest in his demands, for he confessed that only a copyright running forever would really content him, but he said that he was willing to compromise on a robbery of the author that should not begin until it affected only the author's grandchildren. He will probably get something less than that, for we didn't all have pirate ancestors for nothing. End of segment 136, December 10, 1906. A Humorist at His Best. Read by John Greenman. Section 137 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 11, 1906. Mark Twain, lobbyist. He cuts loose from artists and musicians on copyright bill. Special to the New York Times. Washington, December 10th. Uncle Joe Cannon did not comply with Mark Twain's request to get him the thanks of Congress in a hurry, so that Mark, in his new capacity as lobbyist, could go on the floor and seek votes for the copyright bill. Uncle Joe would have done it if he could, for he would do anything for Mark, but even a czar's power is limited. However, he did the next best thing. He turned his private room over to Mark Twain today to do his lobbying in. As soon as the Speaker spread the tidings, Congressmen began to pour in. Mark Twain talked incessantly for 5 hours and a half. He saw 180 members, very nearly half the membership of the House. All the leaders of both parties came in: Grosvenor, Dalzell, Payne, Williams, Champ Clark, and all the rest. Mark Twain did not try to be funny with these 180 congressmen. He fired solid argument at them, and when he got through he had learned something as well as they. He had learned that the authors had made a mistake in tying up their cause to that of the musicians, artists, and other professional men. He discovered that not even his influence and popularity were great enough to save the musicians and artists, that they were doomed anyhow, and that the authors were likely to fall with them unless the bill were split. He also learned that if it was split and the authors got a bill of their own before Congress, it would pass. End of Section 137, December 11, 1906. Mark Twain, lobbyist. Read by John Greenman. Section 138 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 12, 1906. Twain's plan to beat the copyright law, and Watterson says freely that he is a jingo. Twain's plan to beat the copyright law. Will run autobiography in new editions of his old works. To put pirates to rout. His task as a lobbyist finished, so he will return to New York today. Special to the New York Times. Washington, December 11th. Mark Twain has the copyright law beaten to a frazzle. It is from pure altruism, pure interest in authorship as a profession, that he is here booming the copyright extension bill. It doesn't affect him. He has a scheme which puts his children beyond the reach of want till they shall be old ladies, and makes the present copyright law look like a very sick and discomfited pirate indeed. The weapon whereby Mark Twain has vanquished the copyright law is his much heralded autobiography. Hitherto the manner of publication of that work has been shrouded in mystery. It has been given out that it would not be published in book form or published at all in its entirety until after Mark Twain's death. He consented to the publication of a few extracts in the North American Review, where it is now running. Mark Twain looks upon the copyright law as pure robbery. He believes that it is not designed in the interest of the public, but is simply a mechanism whereby, after the author has enjoyed the fruits of his labor for 42 years, his property can be taken from him and handed over to a lot of publishers who had nothing to do with it. He considers it a law for the robbery of an author's children in the interest of the publishers. This is a tolerably conservative statement of his views. A radical statement of them would cause this issue of the Times to be excluded from the mails. For years Mark Twain has devoted his intellect to the question how to beat this law, how to foil this robbery, how to insure to his children the profit of their father's labor, and prevent it from being handed over by the government to some publishers who have never done anything for Mark. How the scheme is worked. And he has devised a way. He has written between a quarter and a half a million words of his autobiography, and is adding to it continually. As soon as the copyright expires on one of his books, Mark Twain or his executors will apply for a new copyright on the book, with a portion of the autobiography run as a footnote. For example, when the copyright on Tom Sawyer expires, a new edition of that book will be published. On each page a rule will be run about two-thirds of the way down the page, and below these lines will be printed the autobiography, or so much of it as is designed for publication in that volume. About one-third of this new edition of Tom Sawyer will be autobiography, separated from the old text only by the rules or lines. The same course will be followed with each book as the copyright expires. So far as possible, the part of the autobiography will be germane to the book in which it appears. For instance, the part which is printed with Innocents Abroad will be mostly that section which relates to the trip of the Innocents and to Mark Twain's other European visits. The part printed with Tom Sawyer will be made up chiefly of Mark Twain's early life in the little Missouri town where he, the real Tom Sawyer, lived. The part printed with Roughing It will consist largely, if not entirely, of the author's life in the West. All arrangements and provisions for the carrying out of this plan, which Mark Twain means as seriously as any man ever meant anything, have been made, and long after his death the autobiography will continue to appear in this form. It is not true that no part will be published in his lifetime. If he is living in 1910, and he certainly looks as if he intended to be alive and lusty then, the first part of the autobiography will appear in that year, for in 1910 the copyright on his first book, Innocents Abroad, will expire. It is true that The Jumping Frog was published first, but that was only a collection of sketches, not lending itself to Mark Twain's present purpose. The copyright on Innocents Abroad will expire late in that year, and the new edition will appear as soon as it does. A new copyright can be obtained on each of these books. Of course it will not entirely prevent piracy, but Mark Twain figures that it will vitiate the sale of editions which do not contain the autobiography and make them worthless. He calculates that it will be as difficult to sell an edition of Innocents Abroad, which does not contain any of the autobiography, as it would be to sell an edition which contained only half or two-thirds of the chapters in the original Innocents Abroad. Got the idea from Scott. He is confirmed in this by the experience of Sir Walter Scott, from whom he got the germ of his idea. Scott kept his copyrights alive by publishing new editions with commentaries. The result was that all editions which did not contain the commentaries were a drug on the market. Nobody would buy them. Mark Twain is certain that what was done with mere commentaries can be done in a much surer fashion with an autobiography. There is no compunction in Mark Twain's mind for the dismay his scheme will spread among the publishers. He holds that they are waiting for his copyrights to expire to rob his daughters, and that after much thought he has devised a way to save his daughters. About its success he has no doubt in the world, and he has planned his execution in the most methodical and elaborate way. He believes his scheme will insure a copyright of 84 years instead of 42, and, as he said the other day, "The children are all I am interested in. Let the grandchildren look out for themselves." He finished his legislative work in behalf of the copyright bill today, and will return to New York tomorrow morning. "My duties as an occasional, unsalaried, professional lobbyist are at an end for the present," he said. He spent the day seeing senators, Mr. Lodge having turned over his committee room for the purpose, as Mr. Cannon had turned over his own room yesterday. In the afternoon he and Albert Bigelow Paine, his secretary, went out to Rock Creek Cemetery for a drive. Strangers paw him. His stay here has been a sort of triumph. Wherever he has gone, crowds of people have hurled themselves upon him to shake his hand. He cannot appear in the lobby of the Willard without becoming instantly the center of a swarm of men and women, strangers to him, who fairly paw him in the exuberance of their joy. This morning he registered his opinion of the elaborate thingamabobs out of which one has to pour cream in high-toned hotels. "Paine," he said, after he had tried to pour some cream into his cup and had landed it in the saucer, "damn this damn, Paine, I am frightfully short of adequate profanity." This article has been edited to include only the portions related to Mark Twain's letter. Watterson says freely that he is a Jingo. At a dinner in his honor the editor raps Roosevelt. Kentuckians his hosts. He says the Constitution was framed to shut off arbitrary powers. Home state God's country. Colonel Henry Watterson, who is soon to sail for Europe, had a farewell last night from the Kentuckians, who gave him a dinner in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, cheered him repeatedly, praised him unstintingly, and listened to a speech by him in which he said that the Constitution of the United States was the organic law of the land, in the light of which the events of the times must be read. He quoted as his view the opinion of Justice Harlan of the Supreme Court that the Constitution was drawn for the purpose of making arbitrary power impossible. The ballroom was filled with upward of 200 Kentuckians, and in the boxes above the diners were many Southern women. The decorations were composed only of American flags. John G. Carlyle presided, and Colonel Watterson sat on his right. Mark Twain writes. Before introducing Colonel Watterson, Mr. Carlyle read this letter from Mark Twain. I am sorrier than I can convey in words that I shall have to be absent when the Kentuckians foregather to do honor to my age-long friend and kinsman Henry Watterson, but such is the case. My 16 years of annual bronchial attacks have consolidated in accordance with present-day policy and become a permanent trust, carrying on business all the year round, without vacations. Therefore my physician has forbidden me to attend public gatherings at night this winter. This with the idea of saving what health is left to me. May Watterson long keep his superfluity of it, since it comes of his being about the best man in the country at the present time, and as far as I think, the only one without sin. End of section 138, December 12, 1906. Twain's plan to beat the copyright law, and Watterson says freely that he is a Jingo. Read by John Greenman. Section 139 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 23, 1906. Twain and the telephone. He hears the telharmonium and incidentally tells a story. The trouble about these beautiful novel things is that they interfere so with one's arrangements. Every time I see or hear a new wonder like this, I have to postpone my death right off. I couldn't possibly leave the world until I have heard this thing again and again. Mark Twain said this as he lounged on the keyboard days in the Telharmonium Music Room in Upper Broadway, swinging his legs, yesterday afternoon. The instrument had just played the Lohengrin Wedding March for him. You see, I read about this in the New York Times last Sunday, said he, and I wanted to hear it. If a great princess marries, what is to hinder all the lamps along the streets on her wedding night playing that march together? Or if a great man should die here, I, for example, they could all be tuned up for a dirge. Of course, I know that it is intended to deliver music all over the town through the telephone, but that hardly appeals as much as it might to a man who for years, because of his addiction to strong language, has tried to conceal his telephone number, just like a chauffeur running away from an accident. When I lived up in Hartford I was the very first man in that part of New England, at least, to put in a telephone, but it was constantly getting me into trouble because of the things I said carelessly. And the family were all so thoughtless. One day, when I was in the garden 50 feet from the house, somebody on the long distance wire who was publishing a story of mine wanted to get the title. Well, the title was the first sentence, "Tell him to go to hell." Before my daughter got it through the wire and through him there was a perfect irruption of profanity in that region. All New England seemed to be listening in, and each time my daughter repeated it she did so with rising emphasis. It was awful. I broke into a cold perspiration, and while the neighborhood rang with it, rushed in and implored her to desist. But she would have the last word, and it was hell, sure enough, every time. Soon after I moved to New York. Perhaps that had something to do with my moving. When I got here and asked for a fireproof telephone, the company sent up a man to me. I opened up all my troubles to him, but he laughed and said it was all right in New York. There was a clause in their contract, he said, allowing every subscriber to talk in his native tongue, and of course they would not make an exception against me. That clause has been a godsend in my case. End of Section 139, December 23, 1906, Twain and the Telephone, and end of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 4, 1900 through 1906, read by John Greenman.